Welcome to the STATMed podcast, where we teach you how to study in med school and how to pass board-style exams. Your hosts are Ryan Orwig and David LaSalle, learning specialists who have decades of experience working with med students and physicians. This episode is the first of two in which Ryan sits down with Jim Culhane from Notre Dame of Maryland University School of Pharmacy. They talk about one of the most important study skills for medical students and professionals, retrieval practice. What it is, how to do it, and why you absolutely should.
Talk about retrieval practice, the importance of it, why it works, some of the history, some of the evidence behind it. And then you and I'll sort of talk about some of the where people get hung up on it, and then we'll go through a few of our favorite ways to have our students engage in retrieval practice.
Here's Ryan.
Hey, welcome to the STATMed Learning Podcast, where we talk about learning in med school and in medical education. I'm Ryan Orwig, learning specialist and creator of the STATMed Learning Program. With me is my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Culhane, the Assistant Dean for Student Academic Success Programs and a Professor of Pharmaceutical Sciences at Notre Dame of Maryland University School of Pharmacy. So Jim, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on board with me. Why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about your background?
Ryan, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I always enjoy having these conversations with you, and that's why it's really great to have a chance to chat today about our topic. So I've been in pharmacy education for over 20 years now. My PhD is in pharmacology and toxicology, and I've helped to launch 2 different schools of pharmacy over the first part of my career. I joined the administrative team here at Notre Dame of Maryland University as the founding chair of pharmaceutical sciences back in 2008, and served in that role up until last year when I assumed a new position as the assistant dean of academic success programs here. My move into that position was largely motivated by my relationship with you that we've developed over the last 10 years and some of the really great things that you've shared with me and my students and the faculty that I work with about evidence-based learning strategies and the unique way that you actually apply those to help your students learn more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, we met, it must have been about 10 years ago. I came up to Baltimore and started working with your faculty, teaching them better methods for teaching and for guiding their students and for hopefully building better lectures.
Yes.
And then we started teaching a version of our StatMed class with students there. And, every year I'm up there we've always just talked about what strategies are the best strategies, where are the pitfalls, where are things breaking down, how do we unlock better learning strategies for your students, for my students, for all these students, right? And that's sort of how we've gotten to know each other, I guess, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you and I both share a real passion for helping students be successful academically. And I think that's really something that we share in common a lot.
And I think you and I are both interested in systems, methods and systems, and how can we give really smart, really motivated students, these professional students, how can we give them tools so that they can be self-empowered and they can unlock their ability, so that we're not just helping them plug holes, but actually building systems themselves so that they can take that into the next semester, take it into the next year, take it for the rest of their career, because these people should be, our students should be lifelong learners, and nobody wants to be inefficient and ineffective. And
right.
It's like that big catchphrase, like nobody teaches smart students how to study. And they get to these doctoral programs, these med school programs, these PharmD programs, these veterinarian programs, and there's a huge percentage of these students that they don't know the best way forward. So, today we're going to talk about that central one of the big book. For me, it's like a bookend piece. For others, it might be more of a central piece for any high-end learning activity, which should be about retrieval practice. So today, what we're going to do is talk about retrieval practice, the importance of it, why it works, some of the history, some of the evidence behind it, and then you and I'll sort of talk about some of where people get hung up on it, and then we'll go through a few of our favorite ways to have our students engage in retrieval practice.
That sounds great. Big fan of retrieval practice for sure.
Yes, yes, you are. So I don't know, maybe give us a little bit of the background, your take on the background of this, what we know about it. Give us a little like mini off the top of your head TED talk.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll do my best. So it's really interesting. My first real exposure to retrieval practice as a evidence-based learning strategy was actually from you, Ryan, when you came to do some faculty development for our faculty and even working with some of our students. I'd never heard the term before. Right. Although when you first explained it to me, it made a lot of sense, and I recognized that many successful students are kind of doing this naturally, this self-testing that many successful students do as they're learning. And as you and I began to work together, kind of in those early years, my interest peaked in some of these things. I began to do a deep dive into the literature, the cognitive psychology and educational psychology literature, to try to learn a little bit more about some of the science and research that's been done that supports the use of things like retrieval practice, and then to think about how I could operationalize this or systematize it, like we talk about, so that I could teach my students how to do this in an effective way. So, what I've learned is that retrieval practice is one of at least a half a dozen powerful evidence-based learning strategies that students can tap into and faculty can use in their teaching to help with learning and helping students to build what I refer to as a durable working knowledge base. So retrieval practice is, my understanding about the history behind retrieval practice is it's built, the term really comes from a broader term called the testing effect. And this was something that was observed and essentially, quote unquote, discovered over 100 years ago. So right. It kind of blows my mind that this testing effect has been known about for so long, but yet in higher education, at least, and in pharmacy education in general, it's just really starting to permeate the programs across the country, and faculty are becoming.
I'll interrupt you and then see if you can get back on your TED Talk horse that I'm throwing you on top of here. So, but yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? It's not just the PharmD programs. It's med school, it's middle school, it's all the way down. Like I was talking to my daughter about this. She's 13, and I'm talking to her about the difference between passively rereading stuff as opposed to engaging in attempts at recall. And she's like, well, yeah, I need to go. This is before the lockdown and everything. She's like, I need to get together with my friend to do this, to quiz myself. I'm like, no, you don't. So we sort of go through all this, and she was like, oh wow, that makes so much sense. And most kids are not that interested in listening to their parents talk about learning theory, but it's like it's not complex, but it's that blind feedback. I think that's part of it. But we don't teach students, smart students, we don't teach anybody really the best practices. I think middle school would be a fine time to start.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that this is one of the huge, I wouldn't say a huge failing, but I think I'd like to turn it and make it more positive and say that I think this is a real opportunity area for primary and secondary education to really pick up on this and teach students this stuff early on.
Well, early and then woven throughout
the curriculum. Yeah,
and that's really nice of you to be positive. I'll take the other side of that. I'll be super negative about it. I will say it's a massive cultural failing. It is a massive cultural failing that we're not teaching students how learning works, the mechanisms of learning. We're seeing this now. Like when I talk to students, mostly med students, physicians who contact me, now they have largely, I would say 50% of them have at least heard of retrieval practice. Oh, I need to do that more. I want to learn more about it. Now look, 10 years ago, no.
Right, no.
Like when I was presenting to you guys. So we're seeing a shift there in the last 10 years. I think there are a lot more people talking about it. I think books like Make It Stick, highly recommended. If you're going to read one book on it, like that book right there, that really helps make a fence post that we can all culturally build around. But no, I absolutely feel like such a massive cultural failing up and down the line of education. But think about this. So think about how far things have come with the science of like exercise and physiology and fitness. If I wanted to like put on X amount of muscle mass, or if I wanted to lose X amount of weight, you can do that. I can find somebody here in my community in West Virginia that could take me through that, either at the gym or a local person through social media, right? Let's talk about movies for a second, because we've talked here for several minutes and we haven't gotten into any pop culture yet. So think about the idea of, say they hired, Chris Pratt to be in Guardians of the Galaxy. And he was sort of this schlubby, chubby, like laughable, like goofball from Parks and Recreation. Then all of a sudden he turns around and he's absolutely ripped and jacked for this movie, right? And they obviously have to like give them the obligatory like shirt off, sweaty, wet muscles. I worked for this, let me put it on screen, right? Like, and they can do this. They can say it's going to take X amount of time to do this. Now, think about where that was in, say, 1980. Okay,
right.
40 years ago. Ugh. But so back then they were making Return of the Jedi, and they tell Carrie Fisher, hey, heads up, you're going to be in a metal bikini for the first quarter of the movie. So, and they kind of look at her, and they're obviously not being very politically correct or sensitive to her feelings. Like, you need to lose some weight. So did they say, here's a dietitian, here's the exercise plan? No. They literally said, eat a lot of celery, and they handed her 2 leg weights, like those sandbag leg weights.
Wow.
And they were like, get ready for this role in a few months. Like, so think about how far we've come as a society, as far as like aesthetically, in movies, physically, with our weight and conditioning, right? But we are in the same place. A little different, like we said, a little more awareness, but up to 10 years ago, we were in the same place as far as like awareness of best practices for learning and studying, which brings me all the way back to you talking about this whole testing effect, discovered, identified over 100 years ago.
Right.
And the fact that, okay, we discovered this back then, and here we are, and it's not a foundational thing that we're teaching everybody. So, sorry about that tangent. But so I don't know. So throwing it back to you, right? So it comes from this idea of the testing effect, showing validity in this idea of retrieval practices. This idea that attempts at recall improve the learning, right? So we're seeing this as far back as then. Then what can you tell us?
Yeah, so I think that, as I take a look at the literature, I think that there were a lot of seminal studies that were done in the 1980s and 90s that brought a lot of this, moved a lot of this theory forward. And so I think it was investigated more deeply and from in very different perspectives. And as you pointed out, Make It Stick was one of those seminal books. Like I said, if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's really great. It talks a lot about this and much better than I can. But I think it's been a process over several decades of really doing more deep investigation into things like retrieval practice, how it can be applied in the classroom, both from a teaching and learning standpoint, and then really getting the word out. And I think that's been the challenge. And like you said, we've moved the needle quite a bit over the last 10 years, but I think we still have, quite a bit of distance left to go. And I always consider myself, I'm not a researcher in this area. Like I said, my background's in pharmacology and toxicology. I'm a scientist essentially, but I think that I like to think of myself as a cheerleader for evidence-based learning strategies in a lot of ways, that just promoting it. The more people that we can get the message out to and get talking about this and thinking about it, the better off our students are going to be.
And therefore our society.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, and this is where I think our passions are. It's like, let's empower these potential engines and give them fuel. And the fuel is the learning methodology. Because if you give people the ability to learn anything, to optimize their ability, then we're going to have the rising tide will lift all ships. So whenever we think about teaching retrieval practice, I mean, I think you can, we have some videos on the web, on the STATMed Learning blog website, on the YouTube channel. You can go and learn about. There's all kinds of stuff on the internet about it now. But just watching a video here and there, or maybe hearing me talk about it or hearing you talk about it, our students aren't going to automatically take to it like the proverbial duck to water or whatever it is. It's like, okay, they understand it, but they're going to often default back to their sort of preset, their original settings, right? So to me, I think the problem is I look at it like a binary situation. This is probably oversimplifying, but that's fine. Where I think on the one hand, you have review-based learning. And to me, I've turned in my lexicon review into a bad word. This idea of review is anytime you have your eyeballs looking over something you've already studied. And it's passive. It gives that sort of that sense of familiarity. It entrenches familiarity. It feels productive, that trap of productivity, but you're not really building anything at that point. Right. Once you've already studied it, once you've already read it, whatever that might be, once you revisit it and it's review based, right? So the opposite side of review to me is this idea of retrieval practice. That's where it fits for me in that sort of simplistic paradigm. And I like teaching simplistic paradigms and then building outward from it, from a framework. But yeah, the idea of retrieval practice is anytime you attempt to recall something that you've already studied and allowing for failure, right? You allow for failure and then you self-check it. And that's where you either, oh, I validate the stuff that I recalled correctly, or oh, I'm actually fixing the stuff that I got wrong because I'm actually correcting it. Now, to me, the biggest problem, and I want you to think about maybe what you think the biggest problem is with teaching it. For me, the biggest problem is it's a blind improvement when you self-test. So to me, it's like, oh, I say I'm trying to recall 20 facts, nice round number, and I remember 8. I didn't get 12. Oh man, it's terrible. It's less than half, right? So then I self-check. Okay, those are the 8 I recalled, and one of them was a little off. I'm fixing it, quote unquote, in my head by seeing it, and then I'm reaffirming the 12. Now, what's happening there is you're solidifying the 8 things you recalled, and then you're increasing. Maybe you're not going to remember all 12, but you're increasing what you're going to recall. The only way to prove it is to do another self-test. Like there's not like a ticker tape printout, like that prints out of your head, like congratulations, you have improved by 46%. You don't get that, right? It's a blind improvement. So to me, I think at that very baseline, primal, behavioral, like gear at the grinds is that you don't get that immediate feedback. So I'll have students in our STATMed class use a very specific form of retrieval practice we set them up with. And you say, you have to do 3 self-tests on the same thing. And invariably they won't. Like my students usually, you say you jump 5 times, they usually jump 10, but for this, it's just like, I didn't get to that part. But every now and then they will do it 3 times. And then they will come at you like a fanatic. Like they have like a zealot who has been converted. They're like, hey, I did that thing on the vaginal infections. I did it 3 times. I'm like, good job. That's what I told you to do. Like, no, it works. I'm like, yeah. No, you don't get it. I'm like, well, okay. Again, I am excited. I like when my students validate all the stuff I'm teaching them. But it's funny because they're so reluctant to do it because it's a beat. You take a beating, right? It's like I studied this stuff and that first attempt to recall it might not go well at all. It might go horribly. But then you self-check, which is a part of the circuit, and then you get the blind improvement. You only find out if you do another self-test. So anyway, so that circuit I'm talking about is where I think it breaks down for most students. What is another problem or similar problem that you might see with like us being the expert saying, please do this, my students? And of course, for those of you listening, like we're teaching methodology, we're teaching rationale. We're not just like throwing it out there, kind of like we are right now. But what do you think is one of the bigger problems of getting our students, our PharmDs, our med students to really engage in this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really the central question I think for me in terms of what I mostly do on a day-to-day basis. I teach in the curriculum, but I'm also an academic coach and work with our students that are in the curriculum that either want to take their learning to the next level or maybe are struggling in their courses and aren't really sure why they are. And so part of what I do with them, and this ties into the retrieval practice piece, is really first sitting down with them and taking a look at different performance metrics, getting them to reflect on how they're preparing for their assessments or their exams, and really getting into the diagnostic component of to try to figure out, okay, what kind of strategies are you using? Are you using those passive learning strategies like rereading your notes or recopying your notes or re-listening to lectures over and over again? We talk a little bit about, are you cramming your studying in 3 or 4 days before an exam, or are you blocking your study, meaning that you pick 1 or 2 days out of the week to study just one subject for many hours, and that can be problematic.
As opposed to distributing
distributed practice with the spacing effect, which is another evidence-based learning strategy, right?
Yes.
Which is I'm a big fan of. But so once I get through that process, it's really about, I think the barrier for me as a coach is really getting them to understand that what they're doing is not working, and doing more of it is not the solution, right? We're doing it harder.
And Jim, isn't that, I think that's a great one right there.
Yeah.
You're trying to get the kid that doesn't know how to swim to let go of the side of the pool, because in their mind, they're like, I made it this far doing this thing, rereading, recopying, rewatching. You're like, I made it this far. I'm getting my doctorate. I'm in a doctoral program. Like, I made it this far doing this thing, and you're telling me that not to do that anymore.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's great. And when you think about it, I can certainly understand where they're coming from, right? I mean, it's a huge leap of faith. You're sitting there with the student, they're looking at you like, who are you? And you're asking me to totally do a retool on how I prepare for these exams. And especially if they're not doing well, they're less likely to take that risk and make the jump. And I think that's what you and I are talking about. One thing I've learned over the year and a half I've been doing academic coaching, is that it's behavior change. Understanding retrieval practice, like you talked about, it's not rocket science, right? It's easy to understand that the more times you bring information to the front of your brain, you try to remember it, the more deeply encoded that information becomes in your long-term memory. And we even know from a neurophysiologic standpoint that there are neuroadaptive changes that occur in the brain at the level of the neuron when you are encoding information. So we know an awful lot about this, not only from a theoretical or a practical standpoint, but also from a biological standpoint. So I guess, what I really like what you said was about how you get your students to try it, right? Get them to try it so that they can see that it's effective. And I do a very similar thing in my coaching sessions with students. And we'll say, all right, here's a couple of different ways we can go about this. Let's practice it and try it and see if you can see its effectiveness. And usually it's very, very quick that they pick up on it.
The key, I think, for us to keep in mind, and of course anybody listening, don't pick like an entire lecture to try it on.
Right.
Pick like a half a column of something. Pick a slide.
A slide. That's exactly what I do. I start with a slide.
Start small and iterate 3 times.
Yep.
Iterate 3 times. Pick 2 slides, interleave them between each other. I don't care. But do it once, recall, get your butt kicked, self-check. Oh, okay, blah, blah, blah. You're not going to feel it. You're just going to be like, oh, wow, I just got punched in the face. That's fine. You're not going to be like, aha, I just learned this. That's not it. Do it again. Self-check, do it again, space it out a little bit, put some stuff in between. That to me is the key for that proof of concept. So I think like what we're talking about is the difficulty of getting them to actually try it, to be able to see it. So I'd say 2 to 3 iterations with self-checking, spacing it in between. Small run, not big run. If it works in the small run, it'll work in the big run. It unfolds. And then the other one, like I said, I think that I'm sort of underscoring that you brought up, is we're trying to get them to abandon their old way, which in the back of their mind, they're like, yeah, but that worked.
Yeah.
That got me. Even if they're unhappy, they're still like, that got me this far. And then I think the most logical conclusion to draw, and you said this, was, well, if I did that, say, for 3 times per topic in my old life, pre-med school, then I'm just going to do it 6 times now. It's just more in my PharmD or my med school program. Therefore, I'll just do more of the same. That's a very logical conclusion to draw. It's just it's wrong.
Exactly.
And I'm like if somebody's doing it these ways that we're sort of disparaging and that works for you, more power to you. I don't want to talk about all students being the same.
Right, because they aren't. You're absolutely right. There are students that are, you could throw them. I always laugh because I have a teenage daughter just like you do, and she's very, very bright. And I always say, you could throw her out in the middle of the desert in a paper bag with a bunch of books, and she would learn just as well as she does. It doesn't matter the conditions. She's just the natural learner.
Yeah, my wife is one of those people. My wife is a clinical pharmacy specialist, infectious disease. Like, Kara's like, what are you doing? How are you? Like, do they just like read it 3 times? Do they read the questions carefully? I'm like, this is not the conversation, because she's on the other end of it.
Yeah, but and just, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that what you just said there was so important is, especially if we have any educators that are listening to the podcast and are thinking about, trying to teach students about retrieval practice. I always tell the faculty that I work with, and I also have a number of postdocs and PhDs fellows that I work with to help prepare them for careers in academics and teach them how to teach. And I always tell them, remember, you're an outlier, just like your wife is, just like my daughter is. You're an outlier, and as you approach students and you're teaching them this technique or any technique to study and prepare for an assessment, just remember that what worked for you is probably not going to work for that student, especially if they're struggling. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that's super important. And I think I would have been one of those students had I been.
Oh yeah, I was one of those students. So.
Thanks for tuning in to the STATMed podcast, and be sure to look for part 2 of this conversation. If you like this show, we hope you'll subscribe. You can find more test-taking and studying strategies specifically developed for med students and physicians over at our blog on statmedlearning.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey there, Ryan Orwig from STATMed Learning. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, we'd appreciate it if you'd hit the thumbs up button below, and we'd love to hear from you, so leave us a comment with your thoughts. To make sure you don't miss future studying and test-taking tips for the medical field, be sure to subscribe to our channel. And when you do, turn on alerts by clicking the bell icon. Thanks again.